I handled the accounts and the correspondence.
The man who proposed to Clara Holt had buried 2 wives before her. She knew it when he rode up. She said yes before the sun moved a hand's width across the Kansas sky. It was the 23rd of October, 1875, and the cold had arrived early that year. Not the honest, clean cold of December that a person could brace for, but a damp, grudging cold that crept under every door and settled in the bones of the walls. Clara felt it in the barn before dawn, when she broke the film of ice off the water trough with the heel of her hand and watched the steam lift off the surface and vanish. 4 months since Thomas had died. 4 months since the typhoid fever had reduced her husband of 11 years to a shrunken, trembling thing in their bed, and then to nothing. 4 months of her doing what had to be done. She counted what was left in the grain barrel that morning with her fingers. Her hand went in past the wrist before it touched anything solid. The 2 remaining cattle were thin along their spines in a way that did not bode well for winter. The root cellar held turnips, dried corn, and a crock of salt pork that would feed 7 children through maybe 6 weeks of hard freeze if she was careful and didn't eat much herself. The baby, not yet weaned, didn't know any of this. He simply needed her, and needed her again, and needed her without end. She came out of the barn into the grey morning light and stood for a moment in the yard, looking at the property Thomas had homesteaded 8 years ago with such confidence and such labour. The fencing ran straight and true. He had been methodical about his fencing, but the house needed re-chinking along the north wall, and the woodpile was less than half what it ought to be for the season, and her eldest son, Marsh, 14 years old and broad across the shoulders, but still a boy in his sleep and his silence, was already splitting wood before school because he understood numbers same as his mother. She was still standing there when Elias Vane came up the road. He rode a good bay horse, well fed and well shod. He himself was perhaps 48, large-framed, with a dark coat that had seen weather but was well cut, and a face that had never been described as warm by anyone Clara had heard speak of it. Elias Vane owned 400 acres to the east, ran cattle, and had twice the grain stores she did. He had been widowed in 1869 and again in 1872. Both wives had come with some property. Both had died on his land. He dismounted at the gate with the ease of a man who did not hurry and did not have to. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Mr. Vane?" By then the boys were appearing. First Marsh from the woodpile, axe still in his hand, without quite meaning to be threatening. Then the 5 middle ones from the house, drawn by the sound of hooves. Samuel, 9, Eli, 8, the twins Caleb and Peter, 6, and young Daniel, 4, who clutched the doorframe in his union suit and stared. Clara had the baby, William, against her hip, wrapped in wool. She could feel the line of her children spread out behind her and to her left like something natural, like a stand of young timber. Elias Vane looked at them all without expression. Then he looked at the grain barrel inside the open barn door, at the thinness of the cattle, at the woodpile. He turned back to Clara. "I'll put my business plainly," he said. "I need a capable woman to run a household, and you need provision for your children. I have the larger property, sufficient stores, and the means to carry 7 children through winter and beyond. I have no use for sentiment, and I don't imagine you do either, under the circumstances. I am proposing marriage, a practical arrangement. If you are willing, we can have it done by circuit judge before the end of the week." The yard was very quiet. The baby reached up and grabbed a fistful of Clara's hair. She felt Marsh go still behind her. She did not turn to look at him. She looked at the grain barrel. "I will give you my answer this evening," she said. "Come back at sundown." He nodded once, remounted, and rode back up the road. She went to Dorothea Crane that afternoon. Dot was 53, built like a fence post and twice as stubborn, and had lived on the Kansas frontier since before it was organized territory. She had buried a husband of her own, but she had done it with money enough to stay independent, and she knew the difference between a widow with options and a widow without them. Clara told her what had been said. Dot listened without interrupting, which was not her usual practice. "You know about his wives?" Dot said when Clara was done. "I know they died." "You know they were not happy before they died." Clara was quiet. "Martha Vane, the first one, she came to me twice in the years before she passed." Dot looked at her hands, then looked back up. She wasn't beaten, wasn't starved, she just dimmed, like a lamp that's being turned down, slow enough you don't notice until the room is nearly dark. By the time she died, she hardly spoke. "I am not Martha Vane," Clara said. Dot looked at her for a long time. "No," she said finally, "you're not. But Clara, think about what you're walking into." "I have thought about it." Clara stood up, smoothing her skirt. "What I cannot think about is my children hungry." She rode home in the thin afternoon light. Marsh was at the north fence when she came back, working on a post that had heaved out of the ground with the first frost. He was working with focused, furious efficiency, the kind of effort that 14-year-old boys deploy when they are trying to prove something to the world and to themselves. The post wasn't going to stay fixed, the ground was too soft, but he was trying anyway, and the sight of it made something in Clara's chest go quiet and painful at the same time. She stood at the fence and watched him work for a moment. "Marsh?" He didn't stop. "I heard him, Mama. I heard everything he said." "Then you know what he's offering." "I know what he's taking." He drove the post with one more strike, stepped back and looked at it. It leaned slightly. He knew it wasn't right. He just stood there anyway. "I can work. I've been working. We can manage." "We cannot manage." She said it without cruelty, because it needed to be said plainly. "We have 6 weeks of stores. The north wall needs chinking. We have no money for feed. You are 14 years old, Marsh, and I love you more than I can say, and you are not enough for this. Neither am I. That is not a failure. That is just the arithmetic." He turned away from her and drove the post again, hard. She left him there. Elias Vane came back at sundown as she'd asked. She was standing in the yard when he arrived, the baby on her hip, the cold orange light spreading flat across the grass. She had made her decision 3 hours ago. She had spent the remaining time making her peace with it. "Yes," she said when he dismounted. He nodded. No relief in it, no pleasure, just the confirmation of an expected outcome. Behind her, from the woodpile, she heard the handle of an axe strike the frozen ground. She did not turn around. Moving day came 4 days later, after a brief ceremony in the Vane parlour before Judge Aldrich, who rode circuit and smelled of tobacco and didn't linger. The children watched from a bench along the wall. Marsh stood through all of it with his arms at his sides and a face that Clara recognised. It was Thomas's face when he was keeping himself composed, which made it almost unbearable to look at. The Vane property was larger than anything her children had seen. The house was 2 full stories, with 4 rooms on the ground floor and 2 above. There was a real cook stove, a separate pantry, a root cellar that went back 20 feet and was stocked with more provision than Clara's entire homestead had produced in 2 years. The barn held 6 horses and a loft of good hay. There were 3 hands who worked the land and slept in the bunkhouse and did not come inside. It should have been a relief. In some cold, practical corner of herself, it was. But the house had a stillness to it that Clara noticed in the first hour and could not stop noticing after that. not the stillness of emptiness. There was furniture, there were pictures on the walls, there were curtains on the windows, but the stillness of a place that had never been loud. The kind of house where sounds happened and then stopped because there was nothing to hold them and carry them forward. Her boys moved through the rooms carefully, as if they were in a church. Elias Vane showed her the kitchen, the pantry, the schedule of meals he kept, and the room she would share with the baby. He showed her these things the way a man shows a new employee the tools of a job. "Supper at 6, he said. "I will be in from the fields by 5:30. I prefer quiet at the table." "The children will need to talk," Clara said. "They may talk before supper, not during." She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that did not invite debate, not because it was hostile, but because the matter was already settled in his accounting of the world. "We'll see," she said, and went back to the kitchen. The first supper was a study in endurance. Clara had cooked a proper meal, roasted pork, cornbread, turnip and onion, and the food was good, genuinely good, and the boys knew they were eating better than they had in months. They sat around Elias Vane's large table, and they were quiet in the way that children are quiet when they are not sure of the rules yet, and the stakes feel high. Young Daniel, 4 years old, and constitutionally incapable of silence for more than 90 seconds, began chattering about the barn horses 15 minutes in. Elias put down his fork. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach across the table. He simply looked at the boy with an attention so complete and so flat that Daniel stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked down at his plate with the expression of a child who has just been told something about the world that he did not previously know. The table was silent after that. The baby fussed from the back room. Clara ate her supper and felt Marsh watching her from across the table and could not meet his eyes. Jonas Vane came on the third evening, arriving from Wichita on a roan gelding that had been ridden hard. He was his brother's opposite in almost every respect. Looser in the face, softer in the mouth, with the particular quality of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life in saloons. He embraced Elias with a clap on the back and turned to Clara with a smile that was genuine and slightly chagrined, as if he already knew something he wished he didn't. "You're braver than most," he said quietly, when Elias had stepped away to speak with the hands. "I'm practical," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. "Sure," he said, and went inside. That night, after the children were upstairs, she heard the two brothers talking in the parlor. She was not trying to listen. She was in the kitchen, banking the stove for the night, and the walls in a frame house carry sound without meaning to. "She's got 7 children," Jonas said. 7. "I know how many she has." "And you're sure about this?" "I don't make arrangements I'm not sure about," Elias said. A pause, the creak of a chair. "No," Jonas said. "You never did." It was Clara who settled the boys each night in the upstairs room, moving between pallets with a low voice and a hand on each forehead, the old ritual of close and settle that she had done since Marsh was an infant, and the words of which she no longer had to think about. The room smelled of wood smoke and 6 unwashed boys and the faint sweetness of straw ticking. Caleb and Peter fell asleep holding hands the way they always did. Daniel curled himself into a ball. Samuel and Eli lay on their backs and whispered to each other until she put a hand on Samuel's chest and he went quiet. Marsh was on a pallet in the corner, looking at the ceiling. She sat down beside him. "It's going to be all right," she said. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, "You keep saying that." She had nothing to add to it. She sat with him until his breathing slowed. On the 5th morning, she sat down at the kitchen table to write to Herschel Pratt, the dry goods merchant in Salina who had carried her account for 3 years. She needed to establish credit on the new property, to let him know the arrangement had changed. It was a practical letter, 4 sentences, the kind of correspondence she had managed herself since Thomas began his decline. Elias came in from the yard as she was finishing it. He read the address on the envelope. He set his hat on the hook behind the door. "I'll take that," he said. Clara looked up. "All commerce comes through me," he said, in exactly the tone he used for the supper rule. Not angry, not loud, just announced, the way a man announces the weather. "I handle the accounts and the correspondence. That's how this house runs." He held out his hand for the letter. She looked at his hand. She looked at the letter. She set it on the table between them and stood up. "I will think about that," she said. He left the letter on the table and went back outside. She stood in the middle of his kitchen for a long moment. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. The baby slept in the back room. The house was enormous and absolutely quiet, and every door in it was technically open, and she understood, standing there with the cold air leaching in under the back door, what Dot Crane had been trying to tell her. It was not the house, it was the pattern of the house. She had watched it for 5 days without naming it. The silence at meals, the letter, the way Elias spoke to her in finished sentences that did not invite a response. Martha Vane had been turned down slow, and Clara had walked through the door that Martha had walked through, with 7 more reasons to stay. She picked the letter up off the table and put it in her apron pocket. That night, after the house was dark and still, Marsh came downstairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway, barefoot on the cold floor. "Mama," his voice was careful. "Did you know he was like this? Before?" She looked at her boy, 14 years old and already carrying too much. "I knew some of it," she said honestly. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, working through something. "What are you going to do?" "I'm thinking on it," she said. He looked at her for another beat. Then he went back upstairs. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. Clara sat at the kitchen table until it was fully dark, and then she went to bed, and she thought, and she did not sleep for a long time. But by the time the grey edge of dawn came through the window, she had stopped thinking and started planning, which was a different thing entirely. Jonas Vane sat by the kitchen stove with a glass of corn whiskey at the 11th night, when the house was well asleep and the Kansas wind was working at the eaves with both hands. He had drunk 2 glasses already. Clara came downstairs for the baby and found him there, and he looked up at her with the face of a man who had been waiting, if not specifically for her, then for the conversation she represented. "Sit down," he said. "I'll tell you about Martha." She sat. He turned the glass in his hands. Outside, the wind pushed hard at the house, and something in the woodpile settled. "Martha Pruitt was a good woman," he said. "Smart. Had a laugh you could hear from outside. She came to this marriage willing enough. Her family hadn't done well, and Elias had the land." He paused. "First year was fine. Second year, she tried to take the wagon to Selena to visit her sister. Elias said the horses were needed for the fields. Third year, she asked again. Same answer. By the 4th year, she'd stopped asking. By the 5th year, she'd stopped most things. She died of pneumonia in February of '69, and I think she was glad to go. And I have never been able to say that about anyone else I've known." Clara was very still. The second wife, Jonas said, was smarter. She didn't have children tying her to the place. She left in the night about a year in, and I don't know where she went, and I don't blame her one bit. He drank. "But you've got 7. "I know I've got 7. He set down the glass. "What I'm telling you is that he won't go to cruelty. He doesn't need to. He'll just not open the gate. Every time you come to a gate, he won't open it. And a year from now, 2 years, you'll stop coming to the gate." Clara looked at the dark window. Her own reflection looked back, faint, the lamplight making her shadowy and indistinct. "Does he know that's what he does?" she asked. Jonas was quiet for a moment. "I think he calls it order." She stood up, took the baby from his basket, and went back to bed. 2 mornings later, Jonas came down before dawn to find his horse saddled and his bedroll tied to the back of it, done by the hand of the hired man at some early hour. His bag was packed. It was sitting by the front door. He stood in the parlour doorway and looked at the bag, and did not need to ask who had arranged it. He found Clara in the kitchen. "He wants me gone," he said. "I know." He looked at her. She was at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot with the baby on her hip, and the particular efficiency of a woman managing multiple things at once. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. It was the kind of apology that knows it's not sufficient. "You told me what I needed to know," she said. "That's worth something." He picked up his hat from the table where he'd left it. He stood there another moment, as if there was something more useful he could say, and could not find it. Then he walked out the front door, and she heard his horse move off down the road toward Wichita, and the sound of it faded, and then there was just the wind. She waited until the evening of the following day. Elias came in from the fields at 5:30, same as always, and went to hang his coat and wash his hands in the basin. Clara was at the table. She had sent the boys outside. Marsh had taken them to the barn to see a foal that had come in the night, and the kitchen was empty except for herself and the baby on her lap, and the supper she had not yet put on the stove. He noticed the cold stove. He turned to look at her. "I want to talk with you," she said. He sat down across from her. He did not look alarmed, precisely, but something in his face reorganized itself into a quality of close attention. "This arrangement," she began, "works because I make it work. You know that. A household with 7 children does not run on its own. The cooking, the washing, the mending, the managing of illness and argument, and the 1,000 things that happen between when the boys wake and when they sleep, that is work, and I do it, and you rely on it." She held his gaze. "I need something in return." His expression did not change. "The household accounts," she said. "I handle them. I correspond with the merchants. You review whatever you wish to review, but the letters come from me. My name is on them." She set her hands flat on the table. "Marsh is given a working role on this property, not a servant's work, a partner's share, supervised by you, but acknowledged. He is 14, and he will be a man in 4 years, and the way you treat him now is the man he will be. I am not willing to see that wasted." She paused. "And the boys eat without silence. Supper is a family meal, not a military exercise." Elias looked at her for a long time. Whatever was happening behind his eyes, he kept it there. "You are renegotiating an agreement already made," he said. "I am telling you what will make the agreement last." The fire in the stove snapped. The baby grabbed at Clara's collar. Outside she could hear the faint voices of her boys coming back from the barn. Marsh's low instruction, Daniel's high response. Elias Vane stood up from the table. He did not answer her right away. He went to the window and stood there looking out at his own land. The wide Kansas flat, the bare cottonwoods along the creek line, the last grey light going out of the west. He stood there long enough that the boys came through the barn door and crossed the yard below. She saw his eyes track them without expression. He turned back. "The accounts," he said, "with review." "Agreed." "The boy works the south pasture. I'll speak to him." "Thank you." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not warmth, not softness. It was more like the look of a man revising an estimate, as if the woman he had purchased a practical arrangement from had turned out to be something more complicated than the transaction implied, and some part of him, buried deep, found this not unwelcome. "Supper in 20 minutes," he said, and went to hang his coat. The first supper at which someone laughed was 12 days later. It was Caleb, one of the twins, who had managed to feed a piece of cornbread to the dog under the table, and the dog had sneezed on Samuel's boot, and the two of them dissolved into a suppressed giggling that compressed itself into shaking shoulders and red faces. Daniel caught it next, without knowing why, and then Peter. Even Eli, who was earnest and took most things seriously, put his hand over his mouth. Elias Vane looked up from his plate. He looked at the boys, at their red faces and shaking shoulders, at William in his basket, waving his arms at the sound. He looked down at his plate again. His expression did not change. He ate another bite. But he said nothing. It was not warmth, exactly. It was the absence of suppression. Clara recognized the difference and accepted it for what it was. Winter came in hard at the end of November, the way Kansas winters will, pushing down from the north with intention. The woodpile was stocked, the root cellar was full, the north wall of the homestead was somebody else's problem now. Clara stood at the kitchen window in the blue dusk and watched her boys come in from the fields. Marsh in front, walking beside Elias's hired man with his shoulders squared. Samuel and Eli running the last 50 feet because it was cold. Daniel riding on the shoulders of the tallest hand and shrieking with the particular joy of 4-year-olds who have been lifted off the ground. William was on her hip, heavy now, pushing up on his hands against her ribs, trying to see. She heard Elias behind her, the floor settling under his step, the sound of him moving through his own house. He passed through the kitchen without speaking and went to the parlor. The fire in the stove was warm. The boys came through the door in a burst of cold air and voices. Marsh looked at her as he came in, a quick, honest look that said nothing specific and everything that needed to be said. She touched his shoulder as he passed. The house was still cold in the way that houses without love are cold, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise to herself. But she was not a ghost in it. She had drawn her lines in the winter air, and they had held, and her children were fed and warm and growing, and she was still entirely herself. That was what she had gone in for. That was what she had come out with. If you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in those 3 chapters, waiting to see if Clara would break, or bend, or disappear into that house, the way the women before her had, then you understand something real about the frontier that doesn't often get told. It wasn't always the storm or the gunfight that broke a person. Sometimes it was just silence, applied with enough patience. Share this one with someone who would have made the same choice Clara did. And if you're here for stories like this, stay close. There are more where this one came from.